Have you ever reached a point where you genuinely believed you had finally figured yourself out, only to find yourself standing in the exact same place again a few months later? Maybe it happens in relationships. You tell yourself that this time you will recognize the signs earlier. This time you will protect your energy. This time you will not lose yourself trying to earn someone else's love or approval. Yet somehow the story unfolds in a familiar way. The faces change, the circumstances change, but the emotional experience feels strangely familiar. Or perhaps your pattern shows up in work. You promise yourself that you will slow down, create more balance, stop carrying everything alone, and stop pushing yourself beyond your limits. Yet eventually you find yourself exhausted again, wondering how you arrived back at the same destination. For some people, the pattern is overthinking. For others, it is people-pleasing, perfectionism, emotional overwhelm, procrastination, self-doubt, overworking, or constantly searching for the next answer. Whatever form it takes, there is often a moment when a person becomes deeply frustrated with themselves. They begin asking difficult questions. Why do I keep doing this? Why do I understand my patterns but still repeat them? Why does insight seem to help for a while, only for old habits to return? Many spiritual teachings and psychological approaches attempt to answer these questions. Some focus on childhood experiences, some focus on trauma, some focus on beliefs, habits, or nervous system conditioning. All of these perspectives have value, but today I want to explore a different possibility. A possibility rooted in one of the oldest spiritual maps of human consciousness ever developed. According to Kabbalah, the tree of life is not merely a mystical symbol. It is not simply a diagram found in ancient texts. It is a living map of the forces operating within every human being. The Sefirot represent different dimensions of consciousness, different ways of perceiving reality, different qualities through which life expresses itself, and perhaps most importantly, they reveal something that modern culture often overlooks. Human suffering is not always the result of weakness. Sometimes it is the result of imbalance. What if the pattern you keep repeating is not your personality? What if it is not a flaw in your character? What if it is not evidence that you are broken? What if one inner force has simply become louder than the others? This question becomes particularly important for highly sensitive and neurodivergent women because many spend years developing extraordinary self-awareness. They learn about psychology. They learn about nervous system regulation. They learn about ADHD, trauma, attachment, hormones, burnout, boundaries, emotional intelligence, spirituality, and personal growth. They often become incredibly skilled at understanding themselves. Yet understanding alone does not always create transformation. In fact, one of the most painful experiences is realizing that you can explain your pattern perfectly and still feel trapped inside it. The reason may be simpler than you think. Human beings are not transformed through understanding alone. We are transformed through balance. And when one force within us becomes dominant while another becomes neglected, life begins to move in circles. The pattern becomes a symptom of a deeper imbalance operating beneath the surface. Consider the force known as Chesed. Chesed represents generosity, openness, compassion, expansion, and giving. It is one of the most beautiful qualities within the human experience. It allows us to care deeply for others. It allows us to forgive. It allows us to connect. Many highly sensitive women naturally possess strong Chesed energy. They can feel what others are feeling. They often understand people deeply. They become the friend everyone calls during a crisis. They become the person who always finds a way to help. At first, this quality feels like a gift, and in many ways it is. But over time, something subtle can happen. The desire to help begins to override the ability to protect oneself. Boundaries become blurry. Exhaustion becomes normal. The needs of others become easier to recognize than one's own needs. The person starts saying yes when every part of their body wants to say no. They continue giving long after their energy has been depleted. Eventually, resentment appears, overwhelm appears, emotional exhaustion appears. The person often assumes they care too much or that they are simply too sensitive. Yet, from a Kabbalistic perspective, the issue is not that Chesed exists. The issue is that Chesed has become disconnected from its balancing force. Gevurah is structure, boundaries, discernment, healthy limits. It is the ability to say no. It is the ability to recognize where your responsibility ends and someone else's begins. Without Gevurah, compassion becomes self-sacrifice. Giving becomes depletion. Love becomes the gradual abandonment of oneself. The person may spend years trying to solve the problem by becoming even kinder, even more understanding, even more available, when what they actually need is not more chesed, but more balance. Yet imbalance can occur in the opposite direction as well. Some people live primarily through Gevurah. They value discipline, responsibility, achievement, and self-control. They are often reliable and capable. Others depend on them because they appear strong. Yet internally, they may be carrying a tremendous amount of pressure. Every mistake feels significant. Every weakness feels unacceptable. Rest feels unearned. Their inner voice becomes increasingly demanding. Over time, life becomes rigid. Creativity begins to disappear. Joy becomes conditional. The person is no longer living through healthy structure, but through constant self-surveillance. They believe their harshness is helping them succeed, yet it quietly drains their vitality. Here again, the solution is not to eliminate Gevurah. The solution is to reconnect Gevurah with Chesed. Structure without compassion eventually becomes a prison. For many neurodivergent minds, another imbalance often appears between Chochmah and Binah. Chochmah is the realm of inspiration. It is the flash of intuition, the sudden insight, the moment when unrelated pieces connect into a larger pattern. Many ADHD minds seem naturally gifted in this area. Ideas arrive quickly, possibilities appear everywhere, connections emerge effortlessly. There is often a profound creativity associated with Chochmah because it allows a person to perceive what does not yet exist. But inspiration alone is not enough. Inspiration requires a vessel. It requires form. It requires development. This is where Binah enters the picture. Binah takes the spark and turns it into something real. It organizes, structures, builds, sustains. When Chochmah becomes dominant without sufficient Binah, life fills with exciting beginnings but very few completions. The person becomes rich in possibilities and poor in execution. New ideas constantly arrive before older ideas have matured. Projects accumulate, dreams accumulate, yet little becomes fully embodied. This can create tremendous frustration because the individual often assumes they have a motivation problem. In reality, they may have a balance problem. Their inspiration is not weak. Their structure is underdeveloped. The flow is stronger than the container. Yet there are also people who live almost entirely through Binah. They seek understanding before action, certainty before movement, explanations before trust. Everything must make sense. Everything must fit into a framework. They become skilled at analysis but disconnected from spontaneity. They understand life intellectually while slowly losing contact with mystery. They know how everything works but forget how to wonder. Another imbalance that defines modern life exists between Netzach and Hod. Netzach is movement, persistence, ambition, momentum. It is the force that says, keep going, keep building, keep producing, keep striving. Modern culture celebrates Netzach constantly. Productivity is praised, busyness is praised, achievement is praised. Many people spend years living almost entirely through Netzach energy. The problem is that the body eventually notices what the mind ignores. Fatigue accumulates, stress accumulates, emotional needs accumulate. The nervous system continues sending signals, but the signals are dismissed in favor of more action. Eventually, burnout appears. Yet burnout is rarely the true problem. Burnout is often the consequence of ignoring another force entirely. That force is Hod. Hod represents reflection, meaning, integration, contemplation, and understanding. It is the ability to stop moving long enough to ask whether the direction still makes sense. Without Hod, life becomes endless motion without wisdom. The person remains productive, but disconnected from themselves. At the same time, Hod has its own shadow. Many highly intelligent and sensitive people become trapped within it. They reflect endlessly, analyze endlessly, research endlessly. They know exactly what they should do. They understand their patterns. They understand their fears. They understand their nervous system. They understand their childhood. They understand their habits. Yet understanding quietly replaces action. The person becomes a spectator of their own life. They wait until they feel completely ready, completely certain, completely prepared. But readiness never fully arrives. Clarity never fully arrives. Life continues moving while they remain in preparation mode. Years later, they are still standing at the edge of the same dream. Perhaps the most important imbalance for spiritual seekers exists between Tiferet and Yesod. Tiferet represents harmony, beauty, truth, authenticity, and the heart. It is the place where wisdom becomes meaningful. It is the place where a person begins to understand who they truly are. Many people spend years developing Tiferet. They explore spirituality, they study archetypes, they learn about healing, they cultivate profound self-awareness. Yet something fascinating happens. Despite all of this insight, life often remains remarkably similar. The same fears appear. The same limitations appear, the same emotional patterns return. This creates a particular kind of suffering because the person genuinely knows better. They understand what is happening. They can explain it beautifully, yet nothing seems to change. At this point, many begin blaming themselves. They assume they lack discipline. They assume they are lazy. They assume something inside them is broken. But perhaps the issue is not a lack of understanding. Perhaps the issue is a lack of Yesod. Yesod is embodiment, integration, practice, consistency. It is the bridge between wisdom and reality, the bridge between insight and action, the bridge between knowing and becoming. Without Yesod, spiritual insight remains an idea. Psychological insight remains an idea. Self-awareness remains an idea. None of it enters daily life. None of it becomes embodied. None of it becomes part of the nervous system. And this may be one of the greatest challenges facing modern seekers. We live in an age overflowing with information. We can listen to podcasts, read books, watch videos, and absorb endless insights. We can understand more than any previous generation. Yet understanding alone does not transform us. Transformation occurs when wisdom enters the body through repeated action, when insight becomes practice, when knowledge becomes behavior, when truth becomes lived experience. The tree of life ultimately teaches something surprisingly compassionate. The goal is not to become more of one thing. The goal is not to become infinitely disciplined, infinitely giving, infinitely spiritual, infinitely productive, or infinitely wise. The goal is integration. Every Sefirah carries a gift. Every Sefirah carries a shadow. The shadow appears whenever one force begins operating without the balancing influence of the others. So perhaps the question is not, why do I keep repeating this pattern? Perhaps the deeper question is, which force within me has become dominant and which force have I stopped listening to? That question changes everything. Because now the pattern is no longer evidence that something is wrong with you. It becomes information, a signal, an invitation toward greater balance. And perhaps the pattern that has followed you for years is not proof that you have failed to grow. Perhaps it is simply the tree of life showing you where integration is still waiting to happen. If this video resonated with you, let me know in the comments. Which Sefirah do you think is currently dominating your life? I read every comment and would genuinely love to hear your reflections. And if you're interested in the intersection of Kabbalah, neurodivergence, archetypes, and practical inner development, subscribe to Sacred Structure. A new video is released every Sunday. Until next time, remember, the goal is not perfection, the goal is balance.